And then there is the economy, of course. I know we're doing well right now compared to the rest of the world and compared to where we thought we would be this time last year, for instance. But first, it's mainly built on government spending and unprecedented debt. And second, long-term challenges remain, with immigration halted indefinitely, state and federal budgets deep in deficit, and global conditions knocked for six by the pandemic. Not to even mention, of course, the trade sanctions that we're facing from China. Little wonder that the Treasurer yesterday focused on finding ways to grow the economy.
If we want to maintain our living standards, generate higher wages and create more jobs, Australia has no alternative than to pursue economic reform, much of which is hard and contested. It is a national imperative. But the recipe for reform is unlikely to be as it was in the past.
Yep, economic reform, productivity, economic growth, that's the only way to deal with the debt. You can't repay all of that. You have to grow the economy so that debt starts to shrink by comparison, of course. The question is exactly what economic reform do you go for and how do you deliver?
Reform is about taking every practical opportunity to make life easier for businesses, to improve the efficiency of government services and to boost competition and innovation across the economy. That is our challenge.
Yep, that is some challenge. So, what next? Let's bring in Ines Willox from the Australian Industry Group. Ines, what's on your wish list for reform?
Well, Chris, I think what the Treasurer laid out yesterday was a pretty sobering picture of where we're at in the COVID environment and the COVID world we live in, and we'll probably live in a COVID-impacted world for as long as you and I are on this earth, and longer probably. So we have to take clear steps to balance health and economics. We've been saying this for a year, but we've really got to turn our attention to economics. As you just said, our economy is being driven by government stimulus at the moment. That cannot last forever. According to the Intergenerational Report, we'll be in debt and deficit until 2061, the way things are going. And that's just not sustainable for long-term growth. So when you think of economics, Chris, you think of the three Ps. You think of population, you think of productivity, and you think of participation. And that brings us back to the issues around migration, around skills and education and training. It brings us back to how do we drive productivity growth. You know, think about how do we improve our ports, how do we improve our infrastructure, how do we improve service delivery from government. That's all crucial. And then we come back to tax reform and regulatory reform. They're the key issues that we need to tackle. It's heartening to hear the Treasurer talk about long-term reform. I think business now is at the point of wanting to see government, state and federal, start to deliver some. I know it's hard, we all know it's hard, but if we don't, we are going to be stuck in a situation where we're going to have declining living standards for our children and our grandchildren. I don't think any of us want that to be our bequest to them.
Look, this is always hard, and it's difficult to get Labor and Liberal, right and left, to agree on reform. But I think the pleasing thing at the moment is this is so drastic, there is no option. For instance, if the situation wasn't so bad, if the debt we were facing wasn't so enormous, you'd have the left perhaps proposing higher taxation to try and get more money into government coffers to pay it down, or perhaps the right suggesting some more privatisations to pay it down. But we're talking about $1 trillion. That ain't going to happen. Our only way out of this, surely, is economic growth.
Yeah, well, you're not going to grow that on trees. So you've got to be smart about it, and you've got to find ways to develop growth. How do we do that? Right now we have a massive skills challenge in Australia. Let's pick on one area. We have 250,000 unfilled jobs in the country, and they range from the semi and very low skilled right through to the very, very highly skilled jobs. We just don't have the people. On the first case, and the second case, we don't have people with the right skills. So we're going to have to make a massive effort over the few years ahead to put our education, skills and training programs and agenda right. It's got to be the great national challenge. If we don't have people with the right skills, we're not going to be able to create the productivity and the revenue to help grow the economy. Now, you're right, I think we all know we face a challenge. The last thing we want now is for our political forces to diverge again over what's important, or to suddenly one side to say spend a bit more here than there. What we want, we're never going to get consensus, but what we want is some agreement at a federal and state level around what we can do to drive the growth that we need. This lockdown in Sydney and the last one in Melbourne are estimated to knock about 1/4 of a point off our GDP at a time when we can least afford that. So we've got to look initially, how do we respond to these COVID outbreaks? And you've gone through that pretty well today. But then how do we get to a growth agenda? How do we get our economy opened up again, bring some certainty and some cohesion to it? And until we get through this period now, we're not going to get the growth. But we should be using this period to think about what the longer term agenda, what's for the country is, what's possible and what's achievable, and then work towards it. Or else we are going to be in years of deficit. Nobody wants that. We don't want that to be the legacy of these past 18 months.
It's so important, yet at the moment we are going backwards with half of the country locked down as we speak. I know, Innes Willox, you'll be pulling your hair out over that as well. You'll end up looking like me if this goes on much longer. Thanks for joining us, Innes.
No, let's hope not. OK, take care, Chris.
Indeed. Innes Willox there from the Australian Industry Group. We've got a lot of work to do to get this country back up and running again in the medium to long term. And one of the easiest things is to get immigration happening again. You talk about population. It should be fairly easy to agree upon the quarantine conditions to get the skilled labour into this country we want. But we'll see. Everything seems difficult when it comes to federal-state cooperation and bipartisan cooperation in this country at the moment.